The dust had settled over everything like a shroud, coating the windowsills of what used to be the Whitman farm, with the fine, persistent grit that seemed to follow Samuel everywhere he went. He stood at the kitchen window, watching the morning sun struggle through the haze that hung perpetually over their land now, turning everything the color of old copper pennies. 3 years of drought had reduced their once fertile fields to cracked earth that split open like wounds, and the creek that used to run clear and cold behind the house had been nothing but a dry scar in the ground since last spring. Martha moved quietly behind him, her footsteps soft on the worn wooden floors as she prepared what little breakfast they had left. The sound of her movements was familiar and comforting, like a prayer repeated so many times it becomes part of your breathing. But even in that familiar rhythm, Samuel could hear the weight she carried, the way her steps had grown heavier with each passing month, as their savings dwindled and their hopes seemed to dry up along with the land. "Coffee's ready," she said, her voice carrying that forced brightness she'd been using lately, the kind of cheerfulness that cost something to maintain. Samuel turned from the window and accepted the cup she offered, noticing how her hands trembled slightly. Not from age, though they were both past 60 now, but from the constant worry that had become their daily companion. They'd built this place together 43 years ago, when the territory was still wild and full of promise. Back then the soil was rich and black, and Samuel could grow corn that stood taller than a man on horseback. Martha had kept chickens and a vegetable garden that fed not just their family but half the settlement when times were hard for others. They'd raised 5 children in this house, watched them grow strong on the food they pulled from this land, seen them off to lives of their own in distant cities where rain still fell and opportunity still bloomed. Now it was just the two of them, and the land that had once been their salvation seemed determined to become their ruin. "Jeremiah stopped by yesterday while you were in town," Martha said, settling into her chair at the kitchen table. Their youngest son lived just 20 miles east, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles for all the good it did them now. "He wants us to come stay with him and Elizabeth until things turn around." Samuel sipped his coffee, which was mostly chicory now since real coffee had become a luxury they couldn't justify. "What did you tell him?" "I told him we'd think about it." Martha's fingers traced the rim of her cup, a gesture Samuel had seen 1,000 times before. It meant she was working up to saying something difficult. "Samuel, maybe we should consider it. This drought can't last forever, but we don't know how much longer we can hold on." The words hung between them like smoke. Samuel understood what she wasn't saying, had been thinking the same thoughts himself, during the long sleepless nights when he'd lie awake calculating and recalculating their dwindling resources. The mortgage payment was due in 6 weeks, and they didn't have it. Hadn't had it for the last 2 months, surviving only on the grace of Jim Patterson at the bank, who'd known them since before his own father died, and left him in charge of other people's dreams and disaster. "I walked the north field again this morning," Samuel said, which wasn't really an answer but wasn't entirely avoiding the question either. "Found some volunteer wheat growing along the fence line. Not much, but it's something." Martha nodded, but he could see in her eyes that she was doing the same calculation he'd done standing in that field. A handful of wheat stalks wouldn't feed them through winter, wouldn't make a dent in what they owed, wouldn't restore what they'd spent a lifetime building. The sound of hoofbeats on the dusty road broke the silence, and they both looked toward the front of the house. Visitors had become rare since the drought started. Most of their neighbors were fighting the same battle they were, and those who weren't had moved on to places where the grass still grew green and the future still seemed possible. Samuel opened the front door to find a stranger dismounting from a tired-looking horse. The man was young, maybe 30, with the kind of lean build that came from hard work and irregular meals. His clothes were dusty from travel, but they were well made, and his boots, though worn, had been expensive once. "Mornin'," the stranger said, touching the brim of his hat. "Name's Daniel Morrison. I'm looking for work, and I heard in town that you could use some help around here." Samuel almost laughed, but there was something in the young man's eyes that stopped him. Not desperation exactly, but a kind of quiet determination that reminded Samuel of himself at that age. "I appreciate you stopping by, but I'm afraid we're not in a position to hire anyone right now." "I'm not looking for wages," Daniel said quickly. "Just room and board and maybe a chance to help with whatever needs doing." I've got some experience with farming, and I'm not afraid of hard work. Martha appeared beside Samuel in the doorway, drawn by curiosity and the maternal instinct that had never quite left her even after their children had grown and gone. "You look like you could use some breakfast," she said to Daniel, and Samuel recognized the tone. It was the same one she'd used with stray cats and injured birds, with their children's friends who'd showed up hungry, with anyone who looked like they needed something she might be able to provide. "I couldn't impose," Daniel said, but his eyes lingered on Martha's face with the kind of hope that suggested he very much wanted to be imposed upon. "Nonsense," Martha replied. "Samuel, help him with his horse. I'll set another place at the table." As Samuel led Daniel's horse to what was left of their barn, the younger man looked around the property with the practiced eye of someone who understood farming. He didn't comment on the withered fields or the empty chicken coop, but Samuel could see him taking inventory, assessing, calculating, just as Samuel himself had done 1,000 times. "Drought hit you pretty hard," Daniel observed, not as a question, but as a simple statement of fact. 3 years running," Samuel confirmed. "Used to be good land, still is underneath all this dust. Just needs rain." Daniel nodded, running his hand along the horse's flank. "I come from up north, near Kansas City. Same story there. Seems like the rain just stopped falling everywhere at once." Over breakfast, Daniel's story emerged in pieces. He'd been farming with his father and 2 brothers until the bank had foreclosed on their place 6 months ago. His family had scattered, his brothers heading west to California where they'd heard there was work in the fruit orchards, his parents moving in with Martha's sister in Missouri. Daniel had chosen to stay in farming country, moving from place to place, working for room and board, learning what he could and helping where he was able. "Seems to me," he said, spooning up the last of Martha's cornbread and molasses, "that times like these are when folks need to stick together, help each other get through until the rain comes back." Samuel studied the young man across the table. There was something about Daniel that reminded him of the early days, when he and Martha had first arrived in this territory with nothing but hope and determination. Maybe it was the way Daniel looked at their worn-out farm, not with pity but with the kind of thoughtful attention that suggested he was seeing possibilities rather than problems. "There's not much to do around here right now," Samuel said carefully. "Fields are too dry to plant anything new, and what we've got growing isn't much to speak of. Sometimes the best work happens when there doesn't seem to be any work to do." Daniel replied, "I noticed your barn roof needs some patching, and that windmill isn't turning the way it should." Little things that might not seem important now but could make a big difference when the rain does come. Martha looked at Samuel across the table, and in that look was a whole conversation they'd had many times before. They'd been alone on this farm for too long, carrying burdens that felt too heavy for 2 people past their prime. Having another set of hands, another strong back, another person who understood the rhythm of farm life might not solve their problems, but it might make those problems feel less insurmountable. "We can offer you a place to sleep in the barn loft," Samuel said slowly. 3 meals a day, such as they are. "But I want to be clear about our situation. We're hanging on by a thread here. Come winter, if things don't turn around, we might lose this place. Then I guess we'd better make sure that doesn't happen," Daniel said simply. That was how Daniel Morrison came to be part of their lives, slipping into the rhythm of their days so naturally it was as if he'd always been there. He patched the barn roof with materials salvaged from an old shed they'd been meaning to tear down anyway. He cleaned out the windmill and got it turning again, coaxing water from deep underground that they hadn't seen in months. He walked the property lines with Samuel, pointing out things that could be salvaged, repaired, or repurposed. But more than the work he did, it was the hope he brought that made the difference. Daniel had a way of looking at their situation that transformed problems into challenges, obstacles into opportunity. When he found the volunteer wheat along the fence line, he didn't see a few struggling stalks, but the beginning of next year's seed crop. When he examined their old equipment, he didn't see rusted machinery but tools that could be restored to usefulness with time and effort. "My grandfather used to say that the difference between a good farmer and a great one wasn't luck or even skill," Daniel told them one evening as they sat on the front porch watching the sun set over their parched fields. "It was the ability to see what could be instead of just what was." Martha had taken to Daniel like he was one of her own sons, fussing over his meals and mending his clothes. But Samuel noticed that she seemed lighter somehow, as if Daniel's presence had reminded her of something she'd forgotten about herself. She started humming again while she worked, started talking about plans for next spring as if next spring was a certainty rather than a hope. "You know what we should do," she said one morning as they watched Daniel working on the old plow, taking it apart piece by piece to clean and oil each component. We should plant a kitchen garden come spring. Nothing fancy, just enough vegetables to feed ourselves and maybe have some left over to sell in town. Samuel looked at his wife with surprise. It had been 2 years since she'd talked about planting anything, 2 years since either of them had made plans that extended beyond the next mortgage payment. You think we'll still be here come spring? I think, Martha said carefully, that we have to act like we will be. Otherwise, what's the point of any of this? It was Daniel who suggested they visit some of their neighbors, the ones who were still hanging on, still fighting the same battle they were. Seems to me, he said, that if folks are going to make it through this, it'll be by helping each other, sharing what they've got, working together on the big jobs. Samuel was skeptical at first. Pride had always been both his strength and his weakness, and the idea of admitting to their neighbors how desperate their situation had become felt like defeat. But Daniel had a way of framing things that made cooperation seem like wisdom rather than weakness. They started with Ben and Clara Thompson, whose farm bordered theirs to the east. Samuel had known Ben for 20 years, had helped him build his first barn, had stood beside him at Clara's bedside when she nearly died giving birth to their youngest. But pride and circumstances had created distance between them over the past few years, each family struggling alone with problems that felt too personal to share. We're thinking about pooling resources for next spring, Daniel explained to Ben as they stood in the Thompsons' dry cornfield. Sharing equipment, maybe coordinating what we plant so we're not all trying to grow the same things. Ben looked skeptical, but Clara was intrigued. Makes sense, she said. We've got that big thresher that's just sitting in the barn, too big for what we're growing now, but perfect if several families were harvesting together. From the Thompsons they visited the Jacobsons, then the McKinneys, then families Samuel had barely spoken to in years. Slowly, carefully, Daniel wove a network of cooperation that began to feel like community again. People started sharing tools, trading skills, coordinating their limited resources for maximum effect. It was Martha who suggested the prayer meeting. Not regular church, she explained to Samuel and Daniel as they ate dinner one evening. Clara Thompson mentioned that her grandmother used to organize prayer circles during the difficult times back in Kentucky. Just neighbors coming together once a week, sharing burdens, asking for strength to keep going. Samuel had never been particularly religious, though he'd always believed in something larger than himself, but he could see the wisdom in Martha's suggestion. People needed hope, needed to feel like they weren't alone in their struggles, needed to believe that their efforts meant something even when the results weren't visible yet. The first prayer meeting was held in the Thompsons' parlor on a Wednesday evening in late October. 7 families attended, 14 people total, sitting in a circle on mismatched chairs and speaking tentatively about their fears and hopes. Clara Thompson read from the book of Psalms, choosing verses about perseverance and faith during difficult times. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, she read, her voice gaining strength as she continued. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures, he leadeth me beside the still waters, he restoreth my soul. Samuel found himself thinking about those words long after the meeting ended. Green pastures seemed like something from a dream now, and still waters were a memory of better times. But the idea of restoration, of souls being repaired and renewed, that resonated with something deep inside him. The prayer meetings became a weekly tradition, moving from house to house, growing slowly as word spread and more neighbors joined. People brought what food they could spare, creating communal meals that felt like celebrations even when the portions were small. Children played together while adults talked about practical matters as much as spiritual ones, sharing information about seed suppliers and weather patterns, discussing strategies for making it through the winter. It was at one of these meetings that old Miss Patterson, Jim Patterson's mother, shared what she called her grandmother's prosperity psalm. During the lean years after the war between the states, she said, her voice carrying the authority of age and experience, my grandmother would read Psalm 23 every morning for 3 days, whenever times got particularly hard. Not because she believed in magic, but because she said it reminded her that provision comes in many forms, and that even in the valley of the shadow of death, we're not alone. The 23rd Psalm, Martha asked. The very one Clara read that first night, Mrs. Patterson confirmed. My grandmother would say that reading it 3 days in a row was like planting seeds of faith. First day to break up the hard ground of despair, second day to plant hope, third day to water it with trust. Samuel noticed how people leaned forward when Miss Patterson spoke, how they hung on her words as if she were sharing secrets that could change their lives. Maybe she was, not because there was anything magical about the words themselves, but because believing in something larger than your immediate circumstances, committing to hope even when hope seemed foolish, that had a power of its own. That night, Martha asked Samuel if he would read the psalm with her for 3 consecutive mornings. "Not because I think it'll make it rain," she explained, as they prepared for bed, "but because I think we need to remember who we are underneath all this work. We need to remember that we've survived hard times before, that we have resources we might not even recognize." Samuel agreed, partly because he could never refuse Martha anything that seemed important to her, but also because something in him responded to the idea of ritual, of marking time with intention rather than just enduring each day as it came. The first morning Samuel felt self-conscious reading the familiar words aloud. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still water." The irony of reading about green pastures and still waters while standing in their dusty kitchen wasn't lost on him, but by the second morning, something had shifted. The words felt less like wishful thinking and more like a declaration of faith in something that transcended their immediate circumstances. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff they comfort." They were walking through a valley, Samuel realized. The drought, the financial pressure, the uncertainty about their future, all of it was a kind of valley. But valleys were places you passed through, not places you stayed forever. On the third morning Daniel joined them, standing quietly in the kitchen as Samuel read the final verses. "Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." After Samuel finished reading, they stood in silence for a moment. Then Daniel spoke, his voice thoughtful and quiet. "You know what strikes me about those words? They're not asking for the problems to go away. They're talking about finding abundance even in the middle of difficulty, finding a way to feast even when enemies surround you." Samuel looked around their modest kitchen, at Martha's preserves lined up on the shelf, even though there hadn't been much fruit to preserve this year. At the clean checkered curtains she'd sewn from feed sacks, at Daniel who had appeared in their lives exactly when they needed him most. Maybe this was what abundance looked like in hard times, not the absence of problems, but the presence of love, community and hope, even in the midst of struggle. That afternoon, Samuel noticed something he'd missed before. The volunteer wheat along the fence line had spread, not dramatically but noticeably. Where there had been a few scattered stalks a month ago, now there were small patches of green breaking through the dusty soil. It wasn't enough to matter economically, but it was something more valuable than money. It was proof that life persisted, that growth was still possible even under the harshest conditions. When he showed Martha and Daniel, they stood together examining the tender shoots, like they were studying precious jewels. "It's not much," Samuel said, feeling the need to manage expectations even in this small moment of hope. "It's everything," Martha replied firmly. "It's proof that the soil is still alive under all this dust. It's proof that when the rain does come, things will grow again." Daniel knelt down and carefully examined one of the wheat plants, noting how its roots had found moisture deep in the soil, how it had adapted to survive in conditions that would have killed less hardy varieties. "This is heritage wheat," he said with excitement. "Look at the color of the kernels, the way the stalks branch. This is the kind of wheat your grandparents would have planted, the kind that survived droughts and harsh winters, because it was bred for endurance rather than maximum yield." Samuel felt something stir in his chest that he barely recognized anymore. It was hope, but more than that, it was the beginning of a plan. "What if we collected the seed from these volunteers?" he asked slowly. "What if we use them to plant next spring, assuming we have anything to plant?" "Heritage varieties are worth their weight in gold to the right buyers," Daniel said. "Millers are starting to pay premium prices for wheat like this, because it makes better bread, stores longer, has more nutrition. Even a small crop could be worth more per bushel than anything you've grown in years." That evening, as they shared dinner and planned their strategy for collecting and storing the volunteer wheat seed, Samuel realized that something fundamental had changed in their household. They were talking about the future again, making plans that extended beyond mere survival. Martha was sketching ideas for next year's kitchen garden in the margins of an old almanac, and Daniel was calculating how much land they could realistically plant if they focused on heritage varieties, rather than trying to compete with large-scale operations. "You know what I've learned these past few months?" Martha said as she closed the almanac and prepared to clear the dinner dishes. "I've learned that abundance isn't about how much you have, it's about recognizing what you have, and using it wisely." Samuel nodded, thinking about all the things they'd discovered in the past few months. The water from the repaired windmill, the volunteer wheat that had been growing unnoticed along their fence line, the network of neighbors who were willing to help and be helped.
Daniel's skills and enthusiasm. The prayer meetings that had created community where before there had been isolation. Martha's resilience and creativity, his own accumulated knowledge of this land and what it could produce under the right conditions. None of these things had cost money. All of them had been there waiting to be noticed, cultivated and used. They were forms of wealth that couldn't be deposited in a bank, but could sustain a family through hard times, and provide the foundation for rebuilding when conditions improve. 3 weeks later, Samuel received a letter from the bank. He opened it with the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied any official correspondence these days, expecting another notice about the overdue mortgage payment, another deadline he wasn't sure they could meet. Instead, he found something unexpected. Jim Patterson had written to inform him that an anonymous benefactor had made a substantial payment towards several local mortgages, including the Whitman farm. The payment would buy them another 6 months, enough time to plant a spring crop and see if their new strategies might bear fruit. Samuel showed the letter to Martha and Daniel with hands that shook slightly. For a moment, none of them spoke. Who would do such a thing? Martha asked finally. Samuel had his suspicions. He'd noticed that several families in their prayer group had received similar letters, and he'd also noticed that Mrs. Patterson had been asking a lot of questions about people's specific situations during recent meetings. The Pattersons had always been comfortable, and old Mrs. Patterson had the kind of practical faith that expressed itself through action rather than just words. But whether his suspicions were correct didn't really matter. What mattered was that someone had seen their struggle and chosen to help, had invested in the belief that their community was worth preserving, that the farms and families that had built this region over decades deserved a chance to survive the current crisis. I think, Daniel said slowly, that this is what Mrs. Patterson's grandmother meant about reading that psalm for 3 days. Not that the words themselves would magically solve problems, but that focusing on faith and hope and community would help you recognize the resources that were already there. Samuel thought about the past 3 months, about how their circumstances had changed, not because of any dramatic external intervention, but because they had changed their approach to those circumstances. They had moved from isolation to community, from despair to hope, from seeing only problems to recognizing possibilities. They had found Daniel, or maybe Daniel had found them, at exactly the right moment. They had reconnected with neighbors who were facing similar challenges. They had discovered heritage wheat growing on their own land. They had learned to see abundance in the midst of scarcity. Maybe, Martha said, prosperity isn't about having everything you want. Maybe it's about wanting what you have and being willing to share it with others. As winter settled over the farm, Samuel found himself feeling more optimistic than he had in years. Not because their problems had disappeared, but because they had learned to approach those problems differently. They spent the short days planning for spring, ordering heritage seeds through a catalog Daniel had found, repairing equipment, and strengthening the bonds with neighbors that would make the difference between success and failure in the coming year. The prayer meetings continued through the winter month, moving from house to house, providing warmth and fellowship during the coldest, darkest time of year. People shared what food they had preserved, told stories that connected them to their history and traditions, and read passages that reminded them of truths larger than their immediate circumstances. And every morning, Samuel and Martha continued to read Psalm 23 together, not just for 3 days, but as a daily practice that grounded them in gratitude and hope. The words had become like a familiar prayer, a reminder of who they were and what they believed even when external evidence suggested they should despair. On the morning in early March when Samuel stepped outside and felt something different in the air, a softness that suggested winter's grip was finally loosening, he found himself thinking about cycles, drought and rain, hardship and abundance, isolation and community, despair and hope. None of these states were permanent. All of them contained the seeds of their opposites. The volunteer wheat along the fence line was showing new growth, bright green shoots pushing through the soil that no longer seemed quite so dusty. In a few weeks they would plant their heritage wheat in fields that had been fallow for too long. Martha's kitchen garden was plotted and planned, and Daniel had located a source for the kind of vegetable seeds that would thrive in their climate, even if the rains were lighter than usual. But more than any of that, they had learned something about wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars or bushels. They had learned that the richest life was one lived in relationship with others, in harmony with the land, and in faith that even the darkest valleys eventually led to green pastures and still water. As Samuel walked back toward the house where Martha was preparing breakfast and Daniel was already planning the day's work, he realized that somewhere in the midst of what had seemed like their darkest hour, they had found their way to a kind of abundance that had nothing to do with the size of their bank account and everything to do with the depth of their connections to each other, their community, and the land they had chosen to call home. The drought would end eventually, the rains would return, But the lessons they had learned about recognizing and cultivating the wealth that already surrounded them, those would last long after the green pastures returned, and the still waters flowed again. They had broken the poverty of isolation and despair, not through any magical formula, but through the simple radical act of opening their hearts to the abundance that had been there all along, waiting to be noticed and shared.